Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson House. I am Elizabeth Karcher. I'm the Executive Director of the Wilson House. We are a site with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to our noon June Zoom series of the Suffrage Speaker Series. It's Why Wait? From Start to Unfinished. A look back at the suffrage series and suffrage centennial. So today we have a speaker, Rebecca Boggs Roberts. She'll join us to give us a lecture about her book and introduce her book to us. We started this suffrage series as a response of having our doors closed. We decided that we'd had a few speakers lined up to come to the Wilson House to give the series, but we realized very shortly that we needed to move to the Zoom platform. And I have to say, Rebecca will be our third on the Zoom, and it has been really amazing. I think we're sold out, if that's possible, on a virtual meeting like this. We've got over 100 guests today, and so it's my pleasure to welcome everyone, and I'm very pleased that this is as successful as it is. We started our research a year ago. I actually need to thank my sister. I was visiting her in New Jersey, and I talked about the Centennial, and she said, why don't you go to Alice Paul's house and look up Alice Paul, and you should start a series of talking about this and getting people knowing about books that are out there. And so a big shout out to my sister for getting that started. I went to a Centennial Suffrage Commission meeting last summer, and when we were introducing ourselves, I said I was from the Woodrow Wilson House, and they looked at me like, wow, that's a surprise that someone from the Wilson House would come to a Centennial Suffrage meeting, but we did, and it's been my pleasure to work with the commission on getting speakers and getting this off the ground for us. So we still have 2 more sessions. Next week we'll have Tina, and she will be talking about Alice Paul and her book. And then Erin Chapman, the last Tuesday in June, will be talking about women and race and the role of women and the change over the last century. So I welcome you to join on those as well. They'll still be free. You just need to dial in advance to get the code to be able to come into the meeting time. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Rebecca Boggs Roberts. She wrote the book Suffragists in Washington, D.C., the 1913 parade and the fight for the vote. And I have to say, I actually have sent this to a number of friends as gifts because I live in Washington, D.C., and I think it's just a terrific book. It's got beautiful images, which she'll share with us today. And so it's really been a terrific, and one of the first things that I looked at when I started this research last summer. Rebecca is, if you haven't had a chance to read the information about her, she's the author of this book. It's The Heroic Struggle of Alice Paul and the National Women's Party as they worked to earn the vote. Ms. Roberts is the author of this book, as well as, and has been many things, including, but not limited to, journalist, producer, tour guide, forensic anthropologist, event planner, political consultant, jazz singer, radio talk show host, and currently she is the curator of programming for Planet World, a museum that is set to open here in Washington, D.C. in 2020. So with that, I welcome you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be here, and thank you all for adapting to this format. I'm particularly proud of the Wilson House for inviting some speakers on suffrage history because Woodrow Wilson does not come off all that well in the discussion of this history. So I am delighted that people are actually interested in accuracy over hagiography, and I think that's something that all historians should strive for. The women in this story were not perfect either, and that takes absolutely nothing away from the size of their accomplishment. In fact, I think it's liberating to discover that these were real live human beings with flaws and mistakes and shortcomings, because it means that we can change the world too. You know, it means that you don't need to be some once in a generation leader to affect change if that's what you want to accomplish. So I'm going to talk about the 1913 parade, and then I'm going to talk about why it mattered and why I see it as sort of the turning point towards the final 7 years that pushed ultimately for the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. And as Elizabeth said, I'd be happy to take your questions through the chat as we get there. So I'd like to start with this image because there's fantastic photographs from the 1913 march, and in fact from the movement in general. Alice Paul in particular was really smart about inviting newspaper coverage of her events, and so the images are professional and gorgeous. But of course they're in black and white. So this is really the only color image that gives you a sense of how rich and visual these events were. This is the original program from the parade. We're lucky if you're here in Washington, once visiting historic sites is a thing again, I do encourage you to go to the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, which is on Capitol Hill on the Senate side, right by Hart. It's the building that used to be known as still Belmont House, because a huge number of these original banners and signs and costumes are there in their collection, and it's absolutely worth seeing. So this is, this heroic image of this woman on horseback with the purple and gold and white of the movement. All of those colors meant something symbolically. Purple is loyalty and white is innocence, all of that, but also, boy, do they look great in black and white photographs. Purple's a really saturated color, white's more of a contrast, gold is somewhere in between. All of that is intentional. All of the way these visuals worked together and were promoted. Caring about the visuals of your campaign is not a function of the Instagram age. They were doing it really well 100 years ago. So the idea for the parade, the plan, was that the women marchers would gather at the Capitol. There were about 5,000 marchers, and they would process down Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol to the White House. So symbolically from the legislative branch to the executive branch, but also down this big wide avenue that's a pretty good place for a parade. And there had been celebratory parades down Pennsylvania Avenue, lots of them, in fact. But this idea of sort of a political march, a march on Washington, taking your cause to the core of federal Washington, this was new. This is the first civil rights march using Washington as a backdrop. And it's about 15 blocks, right, from the Capitol to the White House. There were grandstands set up at the 15th Street end of Pennsylvania Avenue because Woodrow Wilson's inauguration was the next day. At the time, presidents were always inaugurated on March 4th. So this was March 3rd, and Alice Paul had gotten permission to use those grandstands, but they were set up for the inauguration, not for this parade. And the way it was supposed to happen was this woman here on horseback, Jane Burleson, was the Grand Marshal. She was supposed to get up on horseback. There'd be a trumpet signal every few blocks down Pennsylvania Avenue to signal to the other end, down at the Treasury building, that the parade had begun. And that would be the cue for the pageant to begin on the Treasury steps. The parade would march up Pennsylvania Avenue. It would get to Treasury just as the pageant was ending. The pageant participants would join the march. They would all go to DAR Hall. The pageant would perform again for a triumphant crowd, and it would all be beautifully choreographed and planned. That was the way it was supposed to go. Right after Jane Burleson on her horse was Inez Milholland on her horse. You guys might have seen this image a couple of years ago when all the women members of Congress wore white to the State of the Union as a nod to suffrage history. There were a lot of articles about the role of white in the movement, and this image showed up a lot. Actually, Inez Milholland is another really great marketing example. She was a labor lawyer. She was a really accomplished professional. But anytime she was mentioned in the press talked about how pretty she was. The inevitably male, inevitably sexist press. And so Alice Paul basically thought, you know what? I can use that to my advantage. If people are going to talk about how pretty she is, I'm going to put her in a white dress on a white horse and stick a star on her forehead, never lead the parade, and maybe people will take her picture and cover my parade, and I'll get some mileage out of it. By the way, that starry crown was the inspiration for Wonder Woman's crown. There's a little trivia for you. After Inez Milholland on her horse, the working women marched by profession. These are the nurses. The women all wore matching outfits based on their profession. The women writers who marched together purposely stained their outfits with ink. College women marched together by alma mater. That's where Alice Paul was expecting to march. She was in academic robes like these women holding the banners here, expecting to march with her fellow Swarthmore grads. There were floats representing nations that allowed women to vote, representing the few states that allowed women to vote in 1913. There were several floats that represented the history of women that were very ornate and sort of fabulous. There were all female marching bands. It was incredibly well planned and choreographed. There was not a moment of this that was left to chance. And they were anticipating marching the 15 blocks to this pageant on the Treasury steps. The Treasury steps then as now is this big marble plaza up front, it's a pretty good stage. And the pageant was a tableau vivant that was an allegory of Columbia summoning the virtues. This is Columbia here, and I just learned about her red cap of freedom there, which I'm eager to learn more about. But the virtues she summoned were like hope and prosperity and peace. The whole allegory actually had very little to do with suffrage, but boy, did it look great in pictures. It still does. So again, the imagery was super important. And the pageant included children in togas and balloons, and there were at least one live dove involved. And the plan was that the pageant would finish and the parade would go by. So the pageant finishes, they're standing there on the marble steps, and there's no parade. And they look around and they wait for a while, and there's still no parade. They can't really see down Pennsylvania Avenue. They don't really understand where the parade could possibly be. The timing had been worked out pretty carefully. No parade. It wasn't a terribly cold day for early March, but it was still early March in Washington, and these people were barefoot on marble steps. So eventually they just got cold and went inside the Treasury building to wait. No parade. Where was the parade? Why wasn't it processing down Pennsylvania Avenue? They'd gotten the signal that it had started. Where were the marchers? Well, this was Pennsylvania Avenue. So for perspective, if you're a Washingtonian, this is standing at about where Freedom Plaza is now, 12th or 13th Street. You can see the Capitol Way in the background, and that building with the tower on the right side is now the Trump Hotel, was then the post office. Pennsylvania Avenue is a really broad street with really broad sidewalks, and there is no daylight between these people. And if you look closely at this picture, that's a lot of bowler hats. Those are men. They weren't there for the suffrage parade. They were there for the Wilson inauguration the next day. The suffrage parade was a sideshow, and they filled the street and blocked the parade, and they behaved very badly. They yelled at the women, they tripped them, they spit on them, they called them names. The police did absolutely nothing to control this crowd. In some cases, the police joined in the tripping and the spitting and the name calling. Alice Paul, the organizer of this parade, realizes you can't get a parade through this. This is all going to go south in a hurry. And she gets in a car, still in her academic robe, and zigzags up and down the parade route, trying to move the crowd away. And it doesn't work at all. The crowd just folds right back in behind her. Finally, they called in mounted officers from Fort Myer, cavalry officers who came riding into the crowd from the 14th Street side and were able to push the crowd back enough that the parade could process through. But it took hours. And so when the parade finally fights their way through this crowd and the pageant participants join them, by the time they get to DAR Hall, instead of it being this triumphant capstone, they're all furious, right? They're cold, they're dirty, they're insulted, their beautiful, perfect day has been ruined. But Alice Paul, marketing savvy as she was, realized it was the best thing that ever could have happened, that a perfect parade would be in the news for a day. And a near riot was going to keep their movement in the news for weeks. And it is impossible not to think of contemporary circumstances right now, right? I mean, when was the last time there was a march for a political cause down Pennsylvania Avenue? About a minute ago, right? And the coverage of it is as important as the march itself. And Alice Paul recognized that 100 years ago. And she was absolutely right. There was terrific press coverage nationwide. There were congressional hearings. A lot of attention was brought to the cause. This is the Chicago Daily Tribune the next day. Now, you would assume this headline would have been under other circumstances, you know, Woodrow Wilson inaugurated the nation's 28th president, but nope. The headline on the left, mobs at Capitol defy police, block suffrage parade, guards powerless before mass. And then there's many paragraphs about the poorly behaved crowd. But look at the editorial cartoon. There's Wilson hoping for his day in the spotlight. It's his inauguration day. And then, ta-da, there's the suffragist right in front of him, stealing the spotlight from him on his very first day as president. So why did the suffrage movement need this attention? Why did they need this kind of good coverage, considering they had been fighting to get women enfranchised since at least Seneca Falls. You could even date it to before that with Mary Wollstonecraft, but let's start with Seneca Falls. That was 1848. 65 years had already gone by. Why was suffrage so in need of attention and good press? Well, those 65 years had not accomplished a whole lot. I'm going to rip through a whole lot of history here, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the biography of Alice Paul, because I know that's the topic for next week. But if I blow through something that you're curious to hear more about, please ask questions about it. So this is Alice Paul. We'll leave her up while I do this history fast. The Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, if you mark that as the beginning of the movement, throughout the 1850s and 60s, and I know that if you participated last week, you heard a lot about the role of abolition in the movement as well. A lot of women came to the movement through either abolition or temperance. And they became suffragists because they wanted those causes and figured they couldn't get them without the vote. But abolition was a huge overlap with the suffrage movement. So during the Civil War, they really suspended a lot of suffrage effort. And then after the Civil War, when the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment enfranchised Black men but no women, it caused a huge rift in the movement. So there were activists like Lucy Stone and Frederick Douglass and Julia Ward Howe who said, let's take the 15th Amendment as written, enfranchising Black men, and we'll work on women next. And there were people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony who said, we can't accept it as written. We can't keep telling women to wait their turn. We won't accept the 15th Amendment if it doesn't enfranchise women too. And they split and they formed competing groups and they worked at cross purposes and they tore each other down in the press. And they also had competing tactics. So the Stanton-Anthony group continued to push for a federal amendment, and the Stone-Howe-Blackwell group went state by state to try to get enough suffrage passed on a state level that a federal amendment would become inevitable. But they didn't succeed very well. The federal amendment went nowhere. State by state, a few big empty states out west did enfranchise women: Montana, Idaho, Colorado. Those states had so few people living in them, they were trying to maximize their political influence by enfranchising everybody. But it wasn't enough to make politicians in Washington feel like the women's vote was something they needed to care about. And so by the turn of the 20th century, the movement didn't have much to show for it. And by the early years of the 20th century, those initial leaders, Stanton, Anthony, and Lucy Stone, were all dead. And the women who took over, Carrie Chapman Catt, Anna Howard Shaw, they were very smart, very accomplished women, but they weren't the figureheads of the movement that first generation had been. And so the movement was, and the two factions did ultimately come back together in 1890, and they agreed on that state-by-state strategy and more or less let the federal amendment drop. But huge amounts of time and momentum and money and energy had been lost. And they weren't recruiting young women very well, and they weren't succeeding very well state by state. So the movement was really in the doldrums by the beginning of the 20th century. So someone like Alice Paul, who you would have expected to be an activist, really wasn't active in the American movement. She got turned on to the suffrage cause when she went to grad school in England. And England also had this kind of slow and steady suffrage movement, but then they also had this much more guerrilla branch led by Emmeline Pankhurst. And again, you'll probably hear much more about this next week, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters borrowed very militant tactics from other political movements, notably the labor movement, to try to push the suffrage cause. So the faction of the American movement that Alice Paul would go on to lead is often called militant. They had nothing on the British women. The British women were breaking into things. They were at one point they tried to set the Prime Minister's house on fire. They slapped policemen in the face to get arrested on purpose. This article, I don't know where those red marks just came from. That was sort of fascinating. This article on the left talks about how suffragettes determined to force their way into Parliament. Miss Pankhurst says the women certainly will break into the House. It was completely expected that they were going to break the law. And this article on the other side of the screen is an ad for a glazier. Suffragettes may break your windows, but I'm the wee boy who can put them back in. So from an Edinburgh newspaper. By the way, suffragist, suffragette, the word was suffragist. The British press made fun of the suffragists in England, especially the Pankhurst wing, by deriding them as suffragettes. It was meant to be patronizing, right? Oh, you cute little suffragette. They took that word for themselves and imbued it with their own power. And so most properly, the word is suffragist. Suffragette refers to the British movement, specifically the militant wing of the British movement. So Alice Paul goes to graduate school in England. She becomes enthralled by Emmeline Pankhurst. She becomes a militant activist there. She goes to jail. She goes on hunger strike. She goes through all of the difficult, torturous parts of being a militant activist. And she comes back to the US in 1910 and finds this kind of doldrum state of the American movement. She very much wants to inject some of these techniques she's learned abroad into the American cause. And she has an ally in Lucy Burns, who was another American who went to Europe for grad school and was also part of the Pankhurst movement. So the two of them together pitched the idea of this March on Washington to the national leadership. And at first, the National was delighted with them. The parade had been so very successful. But Alice Paul pretty quickly went kind of rogue. She started publishing a competing newsletter to the National. She poached a few donors, most notably Alva Belmont. And Carrie Chapman Catt and Anna Howard Shaw were very nervous that she might start employing some of the more violent law-breaking tactics of the Pankhursts. And ultimately, they kicked her out. So by 1914, Alice Paul had formed the National Women's Party, a competing suffrage group to the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which was always bigger, better funded, all of that. But the National was based in New York. The National Women's Party was based here in Washington. And that was because of another tactical change. So right behind Inez Milholland on her white horse with her Wonder Woman crown was a huge banner that said, "We demand a constitutional amendment enfranchising the women of this nation." It was called the Great Demand Banner. Not "we politely ask," not "we fervently hope," "we demand a constitutional amendment." So the parade, in addition to being a great recruiting tool, getting a bunch of young women who had never been part of the movement, involved in the movement, and getting tons of good press, it was also an announcement that the push for the federal amendment was back and that Washington would now be a focus of the movement. And Alice Paul purposely rented space right on Lafayette Square for the headquarters of the National Women's Party. Again, hard not to think of today's context of political movements in Lafayette Square. If you watch those images of what's been going on the last couple of weeks, or if you were there yourself, you walked right by Cameron House. It's that yellow building with wrought iron, wisteria-covered balconies on the east side of the square. That was the National Women's Party headquarters. So 1915, 1916, the National Women's Party continues to come up with some different publicity stunts, some different campaigns. There's some petition drives. They have a booth at the World's Fair in San Francisco. There's a cross-country automobile trip. And then at the end of 1916, it's a bad time for suffrage. Every state that had suffrage on the ballot in the November elections votes it down. So no new states are added in 1916. And Woodrow Wilson is reelected. Not by much, but he's reelected. And he was a stumbling block. He was a roadblock to suffrage. Again, happy to answer more questions about that. The other thing that happens at the end of 1916 is Inez Milholland, she of the white horse, collapses on stage while giving a speech for suffrage and dies in the hospital shortly thereafter. Her last words, maybe, her sister said, were, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" So the Women's Party sort of licks their wounds at the end of 1916. They've lost this beautiful, brilliant voice for the movement. The anti-suffrage president was back in the White House. No new states have recognized women's right to vote. By the way, I try very hard not to say have given women the vote because, first of all, no one gave anybody anything. The women fought really hard for it. But also, women had the right to vote. They were citizens. It's just that the men in power finally recognized that fact. But none of that happened in 1916. So as 1917 dawned, the National Women's Party thought, we need a new tactic. And they came up with the idea of picketing the White House. Again, it happens every day right now. It had never happened before. It was their idea. And again, very obvious imagery here. That banner says, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" Which may or may not be Inez Milholland's last words. They keep this up through January and February of 1917. In March of 1917, at Wilson's second inauguration, which was a gross early March day, wind sideways and freezing rain and horrible weather, as it sometimes is in early spring here, they expected to do one big grand picket around the White House and then go meet with the president, and then they could stop this picketing stuff. But he wouldn't meet with them. So they kept marching around and around and around the property, and finally decided they were going to keep the pickets up, regardless of what public opinion thought of them, because they felt that they needed to stay in Wilson's face. So by April of 1917, as the US is getting involved in World War I, that becomes a much riskier proposition, right? Now you're criticizing the president during wartime, which some people think is treasonous. And the National Women's Party not only didn't back down and kept the pickets up, but the pickets became even more pointed. So this says, "To the Russian envoys, President Wilson and envoy Root are deceiving Russia. They say, we are a democracy, help us win a world war so that democracies may survive. We, the women of America, tell you that America is not a democracy. 20 million American women are denied the right to vote. President Wilson is the chief opponent of their national enfranchisement. Help us make this nation really free. Tell our government that it must liberate its people before it can claim free Russia as an ally." By the way, that's Lucy Burns on the left. So this is very pointed criticism of President Wilson, who is on the international stage giving a speech a minute about making the world safe for democracy, pointing out the hypocrisy that he remains the stumbling block to enfranchising half of his own population. This is a tweet, right? Like, this is the 1917 equivalent of a viral message. Think what these women would have done with social media. But it was also meant to provoke. And so here is somebody tearing down the Russian envoy banner. And this kind of kept up through the summer of 1917. The banners got even more critical. This is the infamous Kaiser Wilson banner. Kaiser Wilson, have you forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they were not self-governed? 20 million American women are not self-governed. Take the beam out of your own eye. This banner might have been the tipping point for Wilson. This was the point where Wilson really wanted these women off the sidewalk in front of the White House. He had sort of allowed it to happen. He had kind of watched with bemusement as this went on, but at this point, he was really done with this. So the DC police go to arrest the women and get them off the street. But in this kind of comedy of errors, they can't quite figure out what to charge them with, because the women aren't, in fact, breaking any laws. Every so often you'll read something that says that they chained themselves to the White House fence or something. None of that happened. They never broke laws. They stood on a corner with a sign. So they got hauled into jail, and the judge confers with the prosecutors and the cops, and they kind of whisper back and forth, and they come up with the idea of charging them with obstructing the traffic on the sidewalk, which is not a thing at all. But they threaten the women with a night in jail or pay a fine, and thinking that the women will, be all embarrassed and pay their fine and rush back to headquarters with their tails between their legs, which was massively underestimating these women. So of course they all say, we'll go to jail, no problem. There's plenty more women to pick up the pickets tomorrow. So the next time the whole group gets arrested, the judge threatens a longer jail term, and they all take it. Absolutely, we'll go to jail, try us. This escalates throughout the summer and fall of 1917, so insanely, to the point where women are being sentenced to months in the workhouse for standing on a corner with a sign, which is not illegal. The women who were arrested repeatedly, like Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, were often, at one point, Alice Paul was sentenced to 6 months in jail for standing on a corner with a sign. In fact, while she was serving time in the DC jail, at one point, a psychiatrist was sent to evaluate her, hoping that he would find her insane and they could institutionalize her and get her out of the way. The psychiatrist was actually honest and came up with one of my favorite quotes from this period, which is, courage in women is often mistaken for insanity. And usually the women were sent to the DC jail, then as now, on Capitol Hill, on the east side of Capitol Hill by Congressional Cemetery. But occasionally they were sent down to the workhouse in Occoquan, Virginia. And the Occoquan workhouse was one of those sort of progressive era work will make you free situations where the inmates laid the bricks and grew the gardens and sewed the uniforms. And for the most part, when the women were sent there, they were kept in sort of a communal area together. But one night in November of 1917, the warden down there decided he had had enough, and he was an evil dude. And the women were bodily picked up, lifted off the ground, and carried to the punishment cells of the Occoquan workhouse, which were these dark, unlit, unheated cinder block cells with open sewage. And just as horrifying as that sounds, right? Rat-infested, sewage, freezing cold, dark cinder block cells. The women were hurled into these cells, bodily thrown in. Dora Lewis smacked her head on the cinder block and passed out. Her cellmate thought she was dead and had a heart attack. The women started crying out for medical attention. The warden screamed at them to be quiet. Lucy Burns started calling the roll of the women in the dark to try to determine who was okay. And the guards screamed at her to be quiet. She refused, and they chained her, Lucy Burns, with her arms over her head in the dark in this cell for standing on a corner with a sign. This was so out of proportion to the non-crime these women had committed that public opinion started to turn back towards them. That even if you disagreed with these tactics, this is not what America stood for. The other huge thing that happened in the fall of 1917 is that New York passed suffrage. It was at the time the most populous state in the Union. And that was a political turning point for a lot of fence sitters, including the president. The president, who had come up with many reasons to be against suffrage, and again, happy to talk about that further, finally saw that it was more or less inevitable at this point. And he, as the leader of the Democratic Party, felt responsible that if there was this whole new influx of voters who saw the Democratic Party as against them, they were going to vote Republican, and it was going to be a problem. And so by the beginning of 1918, President Wilson and other Democrats started to allow, as maybe the nation wouldn't go directly to hell in a handbasket if the franchise included women. So in the summer of 1918, the federal amendment came back up in front of Congress. It passed the House and failed the Senate. But the 1918 midterms brought a bunch of pro-suffrage members into Washington. And so by 1919, the amendment was finally a realistic possibility. And it did, in fact, finally pass in the summer of 1919. And then it went to the states for ratification. So at the time, there were 48 states. You need 36 to ratify. This is Alice Paul with her ratification banner. Every time a new state ratified, she would sew a new star on her flag. A bunch of states ratified it right away. Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan. A bunch of states voted it down right away, all in the South, and most of them for overtly racist reasons. Those legislatures said they did not want to enfranchise a single new Black voter. They were systematically disenfranchising Black male voters with Jim Crow. That was working for them. And they did not want to see a single new Black voter. So the 19th Amendment was voted down in a bunch of those states. Then there were a bunch of states who wouldn't bring it to a vote for complicated political reasons about special sessions and expenses. By the summer of 1920, 35 states had ratified. You only needed one more. Of the states left on the table, 5 wouldn't bring it to a vote, 6 had voted it down. That leaves 2, North Carolina and Tennessee. The way the South had been going, neither of those looked like a great bet, and North Carolina, in fact, voted it down. Everyone shows up in Tennessee. It's all down to Tennessee. It's the only state left on the table. It's August in 1920. It's really hot in Nashville. Not only does everyone show up, I mean, all the pro-suffragists, all the anti-suffragists, the entire National Press Corps, the Civil War veterans, the Catholic Church, the liquor lobby, who really didn't want women to vote. Not only do they all show up in Nashville, they're all staying in the same hotel. They're all at the Hermitage Hotel together. The liquor lobby has the Jim Beam suite where they're getting everyone too drunk to vote. The Catholic Church is, preaching to whoever will listen about the evils of women leaving the home. The pro-suffragists are sending pretty girls to take the members out to dinner so they'll stay in town and not go back to their districts before the vote. The pro-suffragists wore yellow roses in their lapels. The antis wore red. Some people wore both. It was just, no one had a good whip count on how the vote was going to go. It was insane. The state Senate passes it. It's all down to the state assembly. We're down to the last chamber of the last state. And a few days before the real vote, there was a vote that could be seen as a proxy, and it's a tie. Last chamber, last state, it's a tie. A tie is a loss. You have to win to win. So no one knows how the real vote's going to go. And there's total dirty politicking on all sides. I highly recommend Elaine Weiss's book, The Woman's Hour, about the Tennessee fight. It's fascinating politics. But finally, the day of the actual vote comes around, and one guy changes his mind, Harry Byrne. Harry Byrne hadn't been on anybody's yes list. He was the youngest member of the assembly. His mentor in the assembly was a total troglodyte. No one expected him to vote yes. So everyone sits on him. He's changed his mind. That one vote made all the difference. The 19th Amendment is now ratified because Harry Byrne changed his mind. So this whole national press corps descends on him and says, what made the difference? Why'd you change your mind? Well, it turned out his mama told him to. He had in his pocket a letter from his mother. And this is a terrible reproduction, but in the middle it says, hurrah and vote for suffrage, and don't keep them in doubt. And he said to all that gathered press corps, I believe a good boy does what his mama tells him to do. So Harry Byrne changes his mind. The Tennessee legislature ratifies. That's the 36th state. Alice Paul is able to hang her complete ratification banner out of the window of National Women's Party headquarters on Lafayette Square. By then they had moved across the square to the west side of the square to Jackson Place. And 100 years later, we can celebrate being part of the franchise. So that was a whole lot of information. And now I am eager to hear your questions.
That was terrific. Thank you so much. I'm just, it was really great and beautiful images again. So we have a couple of questions that have come in. The first is, have you ever seen Iron-Jawed Angels film, and how accurate is it in your opinion?
So Iron-Jawed Angels is a movie starring Hilary Swank as Alice Paul, which I actually think is kind of brilliant casting, based on a book. I really recommend the book instead. The movie isn't terribly terrible, but like they invent a love interest for Alice Paul and some stuff that just makes it more Hollywood. The book, on the other hand, is, it's still not a, pointy-headed historical account, but it's, I think, a better source. There's also a movie that came out a couple years ago called Suffragette about the British movement with Meryl Streep as Emmeline Pankhurst, and a fictional young woman getting radicalized by the movement. It is also a blend of fact and fiction, but it does give you a sense of why women got involved and how they went from not really thinking about it to throwing bricks at members of parliament. And it seems like a pretty reasonable step at that point. So check out Suffragette as well.
So that was one of the other questions that came in, and that is, do you have any evidence that Lucy Burns and Alice Paul had stayed in contact with their friends and colleagues and the suffragists in the UK? Yeah,
they absolutely did. And in fact, I give a much longer version of this talk that includes an image of Lucy Burns and Emmeline Pankhurst standing in front of Union Station, because Emmeline Pankhurst would sometimes come to the US on fundraising trips, and Paul and Burns would host her. So even though the National was very nervous about that association and didn't love anybody thinking that Americans would stoop to those tactics, they absolutely stayed in touch. I wanted to, before I get away from the parade, I see there's a question in the chat about African Americans in the parade, and I'm really glad that was asked. the question is, were there any African-American women in the parade? Yes, there were, but. So there was a sorority at Howard, Delta Sigma Theta, that formed specifically to be more politically active than the other sororities that existed. Mary Church Terrell was their advisor, and they wanted their very first act to be to march in this parade. AKA also wanted to march in the parade. And Alice Paul was very nervous that an integrated parade would scare off Southern marchers. And so she punted on their requests and let them dangle for weeks, which was not like her. She usually answered everything very efficiently. And she kind of hemmed and hawed. And this is where her youth and inexperience show. And the National, there's actually, you can see in the Library of Congress collections, there's a telegram from Anna Howard Shaw saying, stop dithering around and let these women march. We are inclusive. They weren't super inclusive, but at least they did want them to march. So Alice Paul finally said, yeah, you can march, but you have to march in a segregated section at the back of the parade. Current Deltas tell me that they, who absolutely hand this story down, right, because it was the founding of their sorority, say they marched wherever they wanted to march. Unfortunately, pictures don't exist. There is a great picture of Ida B. Wells, who wanted no part of a segregated group. She wanted to march with the Illinois delegation, and she absolutely did. The story is that she stayed in the crowd, and as the Illinois delegation came by, she broke into the delegation to march with white supporters with Illinois, and there is a great picture of that. So there were African-American women in the march. They may have been segregated in the back. It was one of many examples of the movement not being particularly inclusive or sensitive to African-American women and the different issues they faced in addition to needing the vote.
What about Native Americans?
Yeah, so, Native Americans were not enfranchised by the 19th Amendment. Right. There was a whole separate voting rights movement for Native Americans because the reservation system was considered a separate nation. So that is a whole separate and very interesting movement. There were women left out of the 19th Amendment, and Native Americans were definitely one of those groups. Also, women who married immigrants. At the time, if you were an American man who married an immigrant woman, you did not give up your citizenship, but the reverse, if you were an American woman and you married an immigrant man, you did. So those women were left out of the 19th Amendment. There at Puerto Rico, Washington, D.C., there were women who were not covered, and Native Americans were definitely among them.
Another question just came in about the pandemic, since we're all here in confinement. Did the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic affect the movement?
I love this question, and 6 months ago, I was never asked it, and now I'm asked it all the time. So I actually did a little homework on it because I was fascinated myself to see, because I'd noticed when you read the correspondence among the women planning these events, there were some events that were canceled in 1918. And so I looked to see what I could find out. There hasn't been a ton written directly on it, but the primary sources do talk about having to change tactics in the 1918 midterm campaigns because large gatherings were banned. So just as now, if you couldn't have too many people in a room together, you couldn't have big campaign events. And so in the 1918 midterms, both the National and the National Women's Party had events that they had to either change to letter writing campaigns or cancel altogether. I don't know that the epidemic changed people's minds about suffrage in a sort of direct one-to-one way, because it's also so caught up in World War I. And I do think World War I changed some people's minds about suffrage because women were in the public sphere in an unprecedented way and taking on responsibility that some sexist men might not have thought they were capable of before that. So I don't feel confident like drawing a one-to-one connection between the pandemic and the movement in terms of lobbying, but it definitely did affect tactics.
And we're actually at the Wilson House going to explore that.
Oh, good.
Yeah, we're putting on an exhibition in the garden coming in. We're working on it now, hopefully, once again, to bring the museum outside. So as I said, we're doing these walking tours, and we'll be doing this exhibit in the garden about the suffrage movement. So there'll be more to follow on that. And it's a big talk about how women working outside the house. But there'll be more to follow. So let's get back to the questions. When the suffragists were being held in jail, was there litigation to get them freed on First Amendment grounds?
Yeah, so yes, I mean, there were habeas corpus attempts. There were attempts to try to get this bogus charge of obstructing the traffic on the sidewalk vacated. And the women did demand political prisoner status. This was a tactic they borrowed from Pankhurst. So Pankhurst had instructed all of her followers that if they were sent to jail, to demand political prisoner status, and when it was denied, which it inevitably was, that then they would go on a hunger strike. So the American women did that as well, and they were force-fed in Washington jails. Force-feeding is just as horrifying as it sounds. And so there were all kinds of attempts about cruel and unusual punishment and all of those to get them out. I must say, ultimately, their charges were totally vacated. So those attempts never got them out of jail at the moment, but by 1918, really, I think it was 1918, it might've been as late as 1919, they were 100% pardoned of all lawbreaking, and it was recognized that the charges were bogus. So those legal efforts did ultimately bear fruit. It just didn't get them out of jail faster.
It's fascinating, the thought that these women would be jailed for being on the street. It's just remarkable.
Right? I mean, also, this was the progressive era. There was a lot of labor unrest at the time. Picketing was specifically legal. And so it was outrageous,
Well, it also there's some parallel, which I always find at the Wilson House, parallels to 100 years ago to things that we're facing today. And the issue with the police and their behavior of these women to the parallel to the police and their behavior with African Americans today. It's just, there's stories,
No
there's things to be learned from the stories of our history. So let's move on to some other questions. I have one. Let's get into the Wilson era, or Wilson and Edith. So tell us a little bit about Wilson and his position and what perhaps convinced him, and Edith Wilson, and what role did she play? Was it a positive or negative? Where did she stand on this?
I love that open-ended question, Elizabeth, since you 100% know the answer. But so Wilson, when he first ran in 1912, did not support suffrage as a presidential candidate. It was not in the Democratic Party platform. And when he was first approached about it on the campaign trail, he said he hadn't thought about it, which is like the worst political excuse ever. So he started to come up with slightly more sophisticated political excuses. He came up with, I'm just the leader of the Democratic Party and it's not part of the party platform. He had written the party platform, but okay. Then he tried, it's a states' rights issue. And the states' rights issue was often pretty racist. I mean, a lot of the states' rights stuff was about the overreach of the Reconstruction amendments after the Civil War and how angry Southern states were that federal law was being imposed upon them. And they insisted on states' rights, which was actually usually a cover for white supremacy, right? So Wilson's support of that was suspect already. And then he actually voted for suffrage in New Jersey, even though it had no prayer of winning, which the suffragists saw right through. It was a way to try to get some, sort of more progressive support in a way that cost him nothing. And meanwhile, he didn't support the federal amendment at all. He then was able to kind of use World War I to say, I'm only going to consider measures that are war measures for a while. That is the excuse that I will give him a slight bit of credit for. I will say that in terms of changing his mind, there are some different schools of thought on this. Carrie Chapman Catt, the leader of the National, was very constant about having these very reasonable meetings. And like all political movements, the sort of moderate and the radical help each other. The radical serves to make the moderate look very reasonable, and the moderate doing the slow, steady work lets the radicals go off and do the attention-grabbing things. And so Carrie Chapman Catt was able to sort of capitalize on not being that crazy Alice Paul to get meetings with Wilson and other cabinet officers. And she did kind of drip, drip, drip steadily on him. And then I do think that the New York suffrage passage in the fall of 1917 made a big difference. And I do think World War I made a big difference. I do think that he saw women taking on roles that he hadn't necessarily given them credit for. Mm-hmm. In terms of Edith specifically, so he marries Edith at the end of 1915. He's reelected in 1916. And then has the stroke in 1919. And so some people think that when she had that sort of stewardship of his presidency, as she called it, she might have whispered in his ear about suffrage. That is not true. She was anti from the beginning. She called the picketers disgusting. She thought the whole thing was tacky and horrible. She never voted herself. And so there's I think no real possibility, but certainly no evidence that he changed his mind because she was working influence on him. His daughters, 2 of his 3 daughters did support suffrage, but that doesn't seem to have made much of a difference to him either.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing. That's a really fascinating story with Edith. She actually, my understanding is she did get to vote, and she did absentee in New Jersey. Is that right? Well,
so in her memoir, which I think we can all take with a grain of salt, she talks about going to the polls in New Jersey and watching him vote. Mm-hmm. And then because she was a resident of the District of Columbia, she did not have voting rights for president. So she talks about never having voted for president. I don't know if she voted for other offices.
We're going to have to look that up. Get to the source on that. Yeah. So one of the questions came in, and it's really, you are a word master, a wordsmith. So the question of, this is you're doing a museum on words, right? So the question is, if we don't use the word granted the right to vote, or demand the right to vote, or we were given the right to vote, how do we describe what's happened here?
Yeah, it's a little tortured, isn't it? You sort of have to use a passive voice, which I don't love as a writer, but the right to vote was recognized. Not that something that didn't exist before was given. Right. So finally, women's rights as citizens were recognized by the 19th Amendment. But were recognized by whom? By the men in power, because that's the only option there. But yeah, that's how I talk about it. I don't love it. If anyone has an alternative that makes me feel a little bit more active verby, I would love to take
it. Well, so I agree. I think when we say, well, we fought for the right to vote, or we were granted the right to vote, that's kind of belittling or making it.
Fought for the right to vote I'll take, because they did fight for the right to be recognized. Mm-hmm. It's just the actual solution that I don't have great.
We don't have a verb for that.
Yeah.
So another one has come in. Was there backlash when the African Americans were not granted the right to vote, or not recognized to be given the right to vote? What kind of backlash did we see from that?
Not given a role in the march, or the right to, because African American women were enfranchised by the 19th Amendment. They, of course, were subject to the same Jim Crow laws that Black men were subject to. Mm-hmm. And that's a whole other area of study. Actually, it's one of the things I'm really happy about with this attention on the Centennial, is much more scholarship about the role of African Americans. But I'm not totally sure I understand the question about backlash about what.
Well, we'll have to get back. So okay. In this whole story, do you have a hero, and who is it?
Oh gosh, what a question. So I admire a lot of these women for different reasons. Hero to me, I don't know. I think a lot of them did incredibly brave things. Alice Paul is one of those people who was so brilliant and so single-minded that I admire the hell out of her. I'm not sure I'd want to sit down and have dinner with her. She was pretty intense, and she does not show any evidence of a sense of humor whatsoever. And whereas Lucy Burns is really funny. But Lucy Burns also, as soon as the 19th Amendment passed, she skedaddled. She was raising a niece as her own and left political activism entirely. You know, Alva Belmont, who was this wealthy widow who funded the National Women's Party almost single-handedly, was a totally fascinating character who absolutely could have sat in her Newport mansion and popped bonbons, and instead got involved in this movement and made all the difference in terms of the finances of it. Carrie Chapman Catt, wow, what an incredible political strategist. She, you know, just was unbelievably good at figuring out on tiny local levels how to win things. So I had, you know, there's a bunch of them I admire. Hero, the movement as a whole, it's so impressive and so far reaching and so starting from absolutely no power that I have to give all these women the credit collectively. That's such a terrible answer, isn't it? I wish I...
No, I love your quote about courage in women is often mistaken for insanity.
Isn't that a good one? Yeah.
Oh, that's fabulous. That is definitely fabulous. And one of the questions that came in was on how was this funded, what kind of fundraising they did. So I think you were able to answer that on...
Yeah, so Alva Belmont was key for the National Women's Party, but they were also doing the like $1, $5 fundraisers all the time. The National, the bigger organization, also had terrible fundraising problems until they got an estate bequeathed to them by the widow who inherited the Leslie's Illustrated newspaper franchise. And so they got like a $2 million estate with a donor who was too dead to meddle, right? So that was a nice little gift for them. So by the end of the ratification fight, the National had secure funding, but the National Women's Party was constantly begging, constantly.
So are these women who had it all, or are these women, what was the profile of the women who were actually marching?
Yeah.
Fundraiser, what were these? They were these women who families and houses and they had it all, or are these women who had nothing else, you know, nothing to lose?
Well, that's a really interesting question, right? So you can't pick at the White House if you have to be at your factory job, you know? So there was definitely a class issue here. And often the most active suffragists were criticized for being sort of dilettante club ladies, because those were the ones who had sort of the time and they cared about the sashes and they, you know, had the money to spend that time. I think that's incredibly demeaning and patronizing. You know, organized club ladies are fearsome and get a huge amount of stuff done, and do not cross them if you know what's good for you. So I think that is the kind of thing that if they were men, people wouldn't dismiss them that way. But there was a class issue for sure. And there were ways, and occasionally because of the progressive era and because there was some labor union influence and some socialist influence in the movement, occasionally there'd be an attempt to try to get working women involved, who were often younger single immigrant women. But it was a push and pull for sure. And in terms of whether these women had families, you know, for the most part, if you had a family, you were home raising them. And so earlier in the movement, there are all these letters back and forth between Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, where Anthony's out on the stump, you know, putting in the frequent flyer miles, and Stanton's home because she had 1 billion children. And so they're constantly writing back and forth, where Stanton is writing these fiery speeches that Anthony delivers because Stanton's home with the kids. And so if you look at the women who emerged in the end of the movement, the 20th century part of the movement, Alice Paul was never married. Lucy Burns was never married. She ended up being an auntie surrogate mother after the movement. Carrie Chapman Catt was married, but did not have children at home. Anna Howard Shaw, not young children, if she had children at all. I mean, it just, the level of dedication, travel, single-mindedness required to be a big leader in this field really precluded a family. And there were women who participated where they could. You know, there are pictures of some of these parades with women pushing strollers in them. And there are stories about, you know, kids coming to headquarters to pick up their mom and being put to work licking envelopes and stuff. But it was either young women who didn't yet have a family or childless women for the most part.
Well, that is, you've done a wonderful job. We still have so many questions coming in, but what I would say is this will be this has been recorded. It will go hopefully on C-SPAN. We will put it on our site at www.woodrowwilsonhouse.org. I encourage those of you who are listening and who've got questions, next week will be Tina Cassidy writing. Her book is about Alice Paul, so you'll get to know a lot more about Alice Paul next week. Please sign up, log in. Rebecca, this was great. Thank you so much. I think we could have a second session. I've got so many questions. So,
no, this was such a treat, and thank you so much for having me.
You did the suffrage walking tour. We're going to have another talk just on the suffrage tour. But I thank everyone in the audience and to my team at the Woodrow Wilson House, and have a great afternoon. Thank you for joining Lunch and Learn, noon June Zoom, and I'll see you next week.